Hello, how are you doing?
I'm doing well. How's I heard you went through puberty.
Yeah, it's finally happening. It's fucking nuts. I'm really excited about it, to be honest. To see,
Like,
and the funny thing
I
is,
was
the interesting thing is, like now with the vaccine as well and the superpower microchips I have, plus puberty, I don't know what the fuck I'm gonna be able to accomplish or look like after puberty. So it's really exciting stuff, actually.
Look, I was a late bloomer too, and when my wife and I got our booster shot,
Hmm.
originally I got J&J
Uh,
because I thought there would sort of naively I thought there would still be long lines for vaccines after April, and so I
uh,
got J&J and got a Moderna booster, which of course gives you sort of magnetic abilities, and so I asked. My wife, we went on a date climbing. We scaled the biggest bridge in Houston with sort of Spider-Man like abilities after getting vaccinated, which I think really is an advantage. I don't know why people are upset about being magnetic.
yeah, holy, that's really cool. I'm so excited. Maybe, this whole politics thing, it's kind of whatever, but at that point, I could just do IRL streaming like Spider-Man IRL and do that type of shit instead. Probably be a lot more lucrative than, this whole politics thing, but yeah, I'll keep that in mind.
Exactly,
Damn.
Swedish Spider-Man. We
Exactly,
need more
exactly.
Swedish superheroes.
Sure. What do we have? We have like, is Thor even Swedish? Where's Thor from? Does he have like a, no, he's like Asgard, right? He doesn't even have like a nationality or whatever, I don't think.
He's like vaguely Norse,
He's
so you
vaguely
could
Norse.
maybe claim you could possibly claim Thor, but it's debatable.
All right, all right. Well, I would rather, to be honest, I'd rather none of us in the Scandinavian have it than Swedes have it because I don't want the Danes having fucking anything. So I think
Ah,
we
okay,
can live
that's
with
fair.
it. All right. Well, feel free to first of all introduce yourself for the people here who don't know who you are.
Well, yeah, sure. So, hey everyone, I am Econoboy. I've sort of when I graduated graduate school in about a year and a half ago or so, I decided that had a lot of free time. So I figured something that could be fun is making sort of as informative as possible videos about economics. For the most part, some about politics, but mostly about economics and I also really love discussions and debates about economics and politics. And so the scripted videos are for education that I produce, and the debates are more fun for me. And one of those debates recently was with Vaush. We spoke about basically unequal exchange and sort of the propensity to reform under a capitalist system, unequal exchange. And what brings me here is Rose Wrist was talking a lot of shit about me, and so I'm here to yell at him.
Well, yeah, it sounds like exactly what I prepared for. You walked right into my trap. Okay. Um,
All right.
so if I've understood correctly, your like what you graduated in, that was economics, right?
Yeah, I did. So my undergrad was economics and political science, and then my grad school was economics, and I did another graduate degree in finance.
Oh, okay. All right. That's a lot of degrees. Um, all right, that sounds good. So I did my like review of that entire debate and took a bunch of notes. And we've talked like a little bit in messages about like how you thought it went, but it was very brief. It was kind of like, hey, most of the things I got and most of the responses I got were positive. I'm pretty happy with my performance. But do you think you could like elaborate like a little bit, maybe talk for just a little bit about a little bit more in depth about how you think the debate went and yeah, how you think you did.
Yeah. It's hard for me to say how the debate went because obviously I'm always going to be, I think for the most part, biased on my own side. If you ever debate someone to the point that they actually would also agree that they lost, you've probably done something very special. And Vosh didn't quite do that with me, but I think I did fairly well. I mean, my when I spoke to Destiny, I think he brought up somewhat of a good point, which was that um, it was almost like you each had different mindsets going into the conversation where I thought it would be kind of a debate but also a bit more discussion oriented, whereas Vosh was very much so this is a debate, it's ideological in nature, and I need to counter everything you say, and that's fair enough, but I wasn't really, I'm not going to get animated, I'm not really the type to yell at someone during debate, not that I wouldn't, but it would take quite a lot to do something like that. And I try to be as cordial as possible. But overall, I mean, I would say that the debate was fairly informative. In terms of sort of audience reaction, it seems like Obviously, people in my audience were very positive about it. People in Destiny's and sort of, I would say, broader sort of sock dimmy type discourse were fairly positive on my performance. And uh, but really, what I cared about was Vosh's audience. You know, what do they think? And it seems kind of mixed. So, like when following his subreddit and YouTube comments, it seems like a mix between calling me a neoliberal and saying that Vosh kind of got a little overly heated during the debate. So it didn't really seem like there was a lot of sort of substantive criticism on either side. And that's part of the reason why I was interested in your critique, which was purely substantive. So that's kind of how I feel about my performance overall.
All right, great. Yeah, so that was definitely something that was obvious, like while watching the debate, which was, yeah, the different mindsets that were going in on. And one of the key things that I think exemplified this quite a bit was the entire segment on the IMF that took up like I think the biggest part of the debate. I think that was the biggest chapter, and then at the end there was another decently big one where you guys discuss unequal exchange and stuff like that. And one of the key things about the IMF part, which I probably think was the part in which Vaush looked the best at. I think part of the reason why that went like it did and how this connects to like your, mindset going into the debate was because it seemed like you were there mostly to just like talk about the IMF, just be like, hey, so this is what it does, this is what it doesn't do, this is why I kind of have issues with it, and just like trying to like learn and move it towards like a productive place when having discussions about the IMF. And on Vaush's side, it was very much okay. I'm here to make like the IMF look bad or whatever. And the way that this was exemplified mostly is because I think you even said this in the debate, is that you aren't like a huge fan of the IMF. You think that there's a bunch of things that they do not great. Let me see if I think I have a quote here from you specifically. Let me see if I can find it. Give me one second. Da, 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 da.
Yeah, while you're finding that, I would want to point out that the IMF section wasn't the biggest part of the debate. I think it was about 25 minutes, but on either side, we ended up with 30 some odd minutes of unequal exchange discussion.
Mhm.
What happened was Vosh made sort of a point that I figured he would make about the IMF and the CIA like always sort of stifling socialist governments, to his point, inadvertently, if they're focused on sort of liberalization, that sort of transitively stifles socialist governments, not directly sort of ideologically motivated. And I wanted to respond to that, but you're right, it definitely got extended. I mean, throughout that entire 25 minutes, I was functionally just repeating myself, and Vosh kept on sort of, you could say talking past each other, but it seemed like we weren't able to really reconcile anything, which is, I guess, understandable.
Yeah, and and you said this towards the end as well of the IMF bit, which was that, and I'm not sure exactly was hard to read into the debates whether you were like making an abstraction like, oh, you could easily make the claim that X, Y, Z, or if you were saying that, hey, I probably believe X, Y, and Z, and those three things were that number one, IMF does bad things, number two, maybe the IMF shouldn't exist, and number three, the IMF probably does more bad than good. And these were three things that you threw out and you talked about there. Now I was a bit confused whether you were like, okay, one could make arguments for this or like I believe in this. But that segment very much sort of illustrated that the whole discussion on the IMF, it wasn't something you had like a big ideological stake in. It was more like a direction that the conversation wandered into, and you just wanted to go back and forth or just like work around and try to build a good characterization and understanding of the IMF as a whole. Whereas on the other side was very much okay, IMF bad, and let's work through this. And that was very obvious because in the end you made these statements and they sound like more or less compatible with like a lot of the stuff that Vosh was saying. But you were still like on different purposes when it comes to having that discussion. How do you feel about that?
No, that's exactly right. I mean, that was one of the things that I tried to get through to Vosh, but he seemed like very like, I don't know how to put it. He seemed very insistent that the framing was incredibly important. Now, I think the framing is important, but not necessarily for the purposes of that conversation. The fundamental disagreement on the IMF was that Vosh was saying that the IMF was an arm of neo-colonial regime change. The issue that I take with that is that it pits the IMF as sort of an, you could say, like, politically ideologically motivated organization, whereas to me the more proper way to view and frame the IMF's decisions are as a lending institution tasked with getting countries to sustainably finance themselves insofar as number one, they can pay off the debts they owe to the IMF, and number two, that they won't necessarily need an IMF bailout in the future. And to me, that explains more actions that the IMF would take than Vaush's thought process that no, we're the IMF. We want full and total liberalization no matter what. And we will have no sort of exceptions in this regard, or at least we're always going to strive for that. And
Mhm.
I don't really think that's necessarily true. And it doesn't really explain all the actions that the IMF takes individually. Something that Destiny brought up that I thought would have been an interesting point in our discussion was um, to a certain extent, if the IMF was so incredibly toxic and bad, why would the countries take these loans, right? And it's not that there's not good responses to that from Bosch's perspective. I just would have been interested in his response,
Mhm.
and maybe that would have been a more productive way to go about it. But generally, I think you're correct. It was more or less 25 minutes of me saying IMF is a bank, and then Bosch saying no, IMF just wants total liberalization, which sort of transitively kills socialist governments, and that back and forth happened until I was finally able to come to like a stopping point and transition the conversation to really the focus of the initial part of the debate, first 20 minutes, which was unequal exchange and the trade relationship between the global north and south.
Yeah, exactly. And it's like you said, right? The whole IMF thing, it was used 2 or 3 times later in the debate to kind of like discredit the things that you were saying that weren't immediately like falsifiable or verifiable in the debate. So like it was something like, I don't know if I'm gonna like take the word for somebody who thinks the IMF is good or whatever. And that was said like 2 or 3 times. So yeah, it was kind of, and
Well,
I think
sure. I
that's
mean,
mhm,
I think to be fair though is that I think that at the point that you're trying to at the point that you're not engaging with the data laid out and you're just trying to personally discredit someone you're speaking with, I'm not sure if it's the fault of the IMF section of the conversation or more the fault of, you could say, Vosh's engagement with the debate and the data that I was presenting. Because to be fair, I never did that with I never said, oh, Vosh, you're just a sociologist. You never studied economics. Why would I trust someone who's ideologically sort of purist? And because that's not really productive. So I'm not sure if that really, I don't think had a material impact. I think arguably it had a material impact in the way that his audience viewed me in the debate. So what I would say is that some of the main criticism I got from his audience, what like I said, wasn't necessarily substantive, although I did receive sort of, substance oriented critiques from his audience. But one of the main criticisms was he's a neoliberal. He defends the IMF, which
mhm,
I wouldn't call myself a neoliberal. And to be fair, I didn't defend the IMF, right?
yeah.
And so, I think that is maybe optically poor performance on my part, but uh, again, I'm not sure
And
other
it
than just
speaks
not
again to like a
addressing his
different
point on
mindset,
the
right?
IMF. Yeah, exactly.
Mm,
Other than just not addressing the point on the IMF, I don't know necessarily what I could have done better. Maybe had more concrete examples. But to be fair, if I had like, I would want to present concrete examples of the IMF doing good things,
mhm,
because I don't think overall the IMF does. It seems like they're quite a neutral organization that in some instances they seem to have helped companies or countries, I should say, and then in some instances they seem to have hurt countries, right? And so it's like arguing with a conservative over national health care, right?
mhm,
So if we compared like Sweden and the US healthcare systems, you're going to be able to find some metrics where the US does better than Sweden and some metrics where the US does worse than Sweden in terms of health outcomes. But
mhm.
the broader argument is that it's mostly neutral and more a marginal case for reform than like an absolutist sort of ideological no, wrong, the IMF and the World Bank fuck over countries, and it's because they are neoliberals who want to stifle any sort of national industry or socialization of the economy, which I don't really agree with.
Yeah, so there's a few things I want to say on that. So for my take on the IMF and what I would have wished like the discussion would have gone into, and I think that you were closer to this side of things, is discussing, okay, IMF, what it does as a World Bank. Could it do any utility or should we just get rid of it entirely? And if we do want to still want to keep it, like what's wrong with making it non-perfect and how do we fix that? So It seems that like there could be a lot of like general utility to having something like the IMF, and the key thing should have been to focus on, okay, how do we make sure that the IMF is more economically in line and in tune with the interests of these developing countries to ensure that they are able to accomplish economic development in as good of a way as possible. And that
Yep.
should have been the discussion. That would have been a lot more interesting. Now, two more
Yeah.
things I want to mention that you brought up here is that number one, Vaush's response to why would they take the loans. The response would then very clearly be, it would be like, okay, well, the country's in like a terrible state, or like not as good, far away from being in a satisfactory state, and IMF is basically the only like possible lifeline they have of potentially ever getting out of
Right.
there.
Like a
So they
payday
hold
loan or something
exactly they hold a
internationally.
disproportionate amount of power over the interaction. So there's a lot of coercive pressures at play in order to make somebody take that loan. And then the third thing I want to say, and this is something I feel like you didn't quite get during the debate, and it seems like it's still there a bit. I don't think, well, actually, I should qualify this. For the most part of the debate, I don't think Vaush's argument was that the IMF is like a hyper ideological neoliberal organization that wants to promote neoliberalism and wants to fight against other forms of ideology like socialism or socializing parts of the economy or whatever it is. The argument he was making for the most part was because of the material interests that are intrinsic to capitalism, institutions like the IMF indirectly have that effect on the world, but that might not be their primary motivator or their primary driver. Now, why I'm saying he did this for the most part of the debate and not for the whole of it is because on certain segments, when he was reading about the history of the IMF, he kind of went back on that a bit. And when they talked about the Cold War and said like, well, actually, hold on, there is actually like an ideological part of this, which I'm not sure why he did. So he kind of flip flopped a bit on that later in the debate. But for the most part, I think that was the argument he was making when it comes to like
Yeah.
the IMF and what it does and stuff like that.
Well, naturally, I mean, I think that was not a frustration of mine, but sort of an area where I'm not able to respond to it necessarily is um, for probably 15% of that debate section, the IMF
Mm-hmm.
section of the debate. Um, he's reading from Wikipedia, right? And there's nothing. I mean, I'm not going to discredit Wikipedia as a source necessarily. It's just that these aren't like. To me, it was clear that Vosh didn't have an actual like root level understanding of the IMF, right? That he had his talking points, right, which was IMF, arm of neocolonial regime change, bad for developing countries, in socialization and nationalization transitively. And I use that word charitably because again, I do understand that his argument wasn't that IMF hates socialism, wants to kill socialism. It was more sort of spurious than that, right?
Mm-hmm.
Um, but at the point that you start reading, the conditional loan arrangements from Wikipedia, and you start reading about different sort of scholarly thinkers and their views on the origins of the IMF, to me it was clear that I don't know if Vosh had never read that before. Basically, is what I'm trying to say, and
Do
to
we
me
just to
trying
be
to
hyper charitable? Do we know that though, or do we think that hey, maybe he just like went up there again because it got brought up? It wasn't necessarily like discussed before the debate that was going to be brought up, so he went back to it. He kind of knew more or less what existed there, and he looked for it, and then was able to like make sure he represented it correctly during the debate. Do we know that that wasn't the case, or is it just kind of like okay,
no,
it seems
it's
like that wasn't the case?
Yeah, it's totally possible that Vosh, like, how do I put it? It seems like what you're saying is it's possible indeed that Vosh, instead of not knowing those things, was rather not sure of the specifics, and he
Mm-hmm.
just wanted to delineate those specifics. I suppose that's possible. That's not the feeling that I got during the debate, though. It's true that what both of us just said could be equally possible. And perhaps I'm biased in that regard, but so that was my feeling in the debate regarding the IMF section. And I think you're right to a certain extent. I think that Vosh sort of the part of the Wikipedia that he read sort of seems to contradict his original point, which was that indeed the IMF isn't necessarily ideologically motivated, but then the Wikipedia seemed to make that case. Something
And then
that
he kind
I'm
of went
looking
back on
forward.
that a bit as well, personally, as well for his case. It's not like he just read that off and like, oh, some people think this.
Yeah,
He kind of tried to incorporate it, which was kind of in direct opposition to what he said before.
yeah.
But
Well, when he read that section, I think his statement afterwards, like the free statement, was more that, oh, um, yeah, he said, I don't think this is like a crazy lefty take or something like that. And it's like, okay, well, maybe not. That's to be fair when I ended sort of the discussion and moved back to unequal exchange because frankly, we were going in circles. and had my closing argument on that, and then moved to unequal exchange. But what I was going to say is that to be fair, something that Yuri from the Money and Macro YouTube channel pointed out to me after the discussion was that um, frankly, he's a banking and credit sort of economist.
Hmm.
He's an actual like academic economist, whereas I'm just a grad like got a master's degree. And
Hmm.
there's a it might not sound like a big gap, but there's a huge gap of knowledge between and a huge gap in specialization between someone with a master's and a PhD.
Hmm.
And he's definitely got that knowledge and specialization, banking and credit, international markets, FX rates, stuff like that. And he said that there were deficits in understanding the IMF from both sides. And so we actually are going to have a conversation on Sunday about it. And I'm definitely looking forward to that um, because the last thing I'll say is that the video that I released on the IMF, which talked about the sort of voting proportion and the governing structure of the IMF and how dynamically the IMF does what they do, um, the current structure actually was a relatively recent adoption. The voting proportions that I mentioned, I didn't look into like the bylaw history of the IMF. I just looked at the bylaws, and a lot of those voting proportions were actually determined after the U.S. signed off on them in 2015, which did reorient the IMF to be much more focused on developing countries and could say a more holistic mindset regarding their economic development, which, to be fair, doesn't necessarily contradict anything that I've said. It's just part of the sort of information and depth that could have been useful in that IMF exchange overall. But I do agree. I think this is actually the last thing I'll say is that uh, the IMF portion of the debate was definitely the part in the debate where I don't feel like I did as well. People can have arguments on who did better. I mean, it doesn't really matter, but I do think I could have done better in that section for sure.
And I think the fact that it came before, like the main section, according to like the part you found most interesting, which was the unequal exchange part, that can also like color how the rest of the debate goes and kind of make different debaters like more predisposed towards interpreting opposition arguments and charitability and stuff like that a lot like different for the rest of the debate. So yeah, I think that was mostly it on the IMF bit, I guess. I think that like overall there was a very clear mismatch in like an understanding between the two positions there. And it kind of contribute to that not being super duper productive, and then it was kind of used to like to beat over your head for the rest of the debate. So yeah, that was kind of the IMF bit. Now I want to talk about the opening for a second, both because chronologically that makes sense, but also because here I think you
All right.
alluded to something that it would have been amazing if this was brought up, and I think this is the main grievance I have with the debate as a whole. So in the
All
opening,
right.
you guys talk a bit about so Vaush opens up by saying that hey, social democracies are still imperialist, they still require inequality to function, and he mentions an equal exchange there. Now you say yeah, on the topic of an equal exchange, it's fairly low. You said 3%, but it can still be solved from within capitalism. And then we got to like an interesting argument here, which was that Vaush said that he doesn't necessarily believe that this will ever be solved within capitalism, and there will be no will to reform that. And then you brought up the argument about how, hey, social and cultural paradigms change, and this was fairly well substantiated during the debate, so they could easily change to the point to which there would be the political will to solve these issues. And you also threw this in there, which you said that, hey, even though you might not think that's very likely, it's still probably more likely than, for instance, like a global socialist like revolution or shift towards that mode of production. And I think what this sort of alludes to is a key like clash in the debate that was never addressed, which was that the entire debate was over how your system is incapable of properly addressing unequal exchange, while you never saw Vaush's system and how his mode of socialism was challenged and how that was substantiated to be able to deal with these issues better than what your or the social democratic system would be able to. And that would have been super interesting to hear. And it's necessary for you to reach like a conclusion on the actual debate question as a whole. And also, given my understanding of Vaush's system, which is like market socialism, I would just have been super interested to see what arguments would have been done there. And I think that was the key thing that really, like, the key grievance side with the debate, so to say.
Yeah, I do understand that grievance. And I do agree that it could have been brought up. The problem is that we were time constrained to a certain extent. If it was a 3 hour debate, I totally agree. I mean, ultimately, there's not as much runway with what we talked about to go 3 hours, and so I probably would have pivoted to that at some point, tried to come to a closing on the capitalist side, and then pivoted more towards his system and defending the idea that his system would solve for it. But it was sort of a purposeful decision on me that I didn't want to pivot to that because that's not necessarily exactly what the debate was about, right? The exact sort of topic of the debate wasn't which system would solve this problem better. The
Hmm.
exact topic was, um, can capitalism solve this problem? And to what extent is this a problem currently?
Okay.
And so, on one hand, you're right. It would have been good offense for me to continuously be like, okay, well, market socialism wouldn't solve this. Socialist systems more generally wouldn't solve this. Communism wouldn't solve this. Anarchism certainly wouldn't solve this.
All
And
right.
so, it would have been good offense on my part. But again, I was just more interested in sort of the descriptive reality that we lived in today, and not necessarily, the and sort of the tendency towards the prescriptions under capitalism, rather than a more my prescription versus your prescription debate. I hope that makes sense. I do agree that it's probably unsatisfying for some more capitalist oriented viewers that I didn't go that route. But I did say in a comment in one of my videos that, if Vaush is ever down to speak with me again, which I don't have any reason why I wouldn't be necessarily, maybe a scheduling issue, but other than that, I do think I would want that to be the debate, right? Which is, we've had the capitalist sort of, defense debate. Now I want you to defend your system and how you would actually solve these sorts of issues with the economy as you see them.
Yeah, I see what you mean there. And so, just to ensure I understand, you wanted the debate to be more descriptive, right, than prescriptive. Sorry, and because of that, it was kind of just like, okay, what happens today? And believe it or not, this may come as a shock to a lot of you, but today is capitalism. So that's why most of the debate was focused around how capitalism will be able to deal with these things, as opposed to like, okay, problem, capitalism versus social democracy, go. So I understand that, I guess. Um, I think that wasn't clear to because I didn't follow like necessarily a lot of the build up to it, and from just watching the debate and from like the title of from your channel as well, debating Vaush on social democracy and socialism, it kind of sounded like that was the main thing there. But yeah, I can understand how that like behind the scenes communication
Oh yeah,
led to
that's
this
fair.
type of stuff.
I did put like the broadest possible title that
It's a
that I
YouTube
could
algorithm
have.
stuff, yeah.
Uh, yeah, exactly. And part of that's maybe marketing. But the I think it's spelled out in the description. But how do I put it? Um, the original sort of push of the conversation revolved around a video that Vosh released. I think on I think one of his second channels,
Hmm.
about the Norwegian economy, and then I tweeted at him, and then we kind of just went from there. Uh, but understandably, possibly confusing given the marketing that happened with the debate as well.
Hmm. Yeah, I see. And then just like a, I guess a general piece of feedback I can give here is that, hey, if there are debates being done that are descriptive, and your position or your ideological predilection or whatever is the current thing that is in position more or less more so than the opposition, then a descriptive debate is never really going to be in your favor if you are the person that has your like ideology or has you plan enacted at the moment, because there will be so much more evidence, so much more information, so many more flaws that exist that we know about now because that is the modus operandi, that is how things function as a whole. Whereas the other person then who has like a different set of prescriptions, because that's not enacted, unless you specifically try to direct the conversation towards, okay, how would this work under your system? That will never really like be addressed, and you will be at a disadvantage just because of like the disparity in the amount of information and evidence available for both sides there. But hey, once again, this speaks to the mindsets of the debate. This probably wouldn't have been as much of an issue, assuming that it had been made like more clear before the debate that you guys would be on the same sort of like framework for going into this and for talking about this. But yeah, that was still like that was the main thing. I guess it would have been so interesting to see how Vaush would have met
Yeah,
the burden with his system for all of this stuff.
no, for sure. I think I saw a Vosh debate. I think it was. I don't think it was the debate with Mel, but I think he actually mentioned this when he spoke with Mel. And oh, sorry, I gotta plug in my laptop. But when he mentioned the debate with Mel, or he mentioned in the debate with Mel, I should say,
Hmm.
that the way that he would solve this is more or less not necessarily making everything like a co-op or like a market socialist system domestically would somehow sort of solve the issues of unequal exchange. I think he
Hmm.
would concede that almost immediately. I think the argument that he made in that debate was that he would want somehow or some way to get the global south to develop cooperative trading blocks with each other. That way, they wouldn't be as reliant on the global north for investment. So, part of the coercive elements of that system would be alleviated with a global south that well, to be fair, they already do mostly trade with each other, I think. But
Hmm.
a global south that is much less reliant on sort of cash flows from the global north. That's an even more theoretical conversation. That's I think hard to defend and probably equally hard to attack because it's so abstract. But um, anyway, but I think that's the direction that sort of conversation would have gone because I've seen him say that a couple times,
Yeah.
and that could be an interesting debate if delved into more deeply.
But couldn't those types of like trade agreements and trade things be done under social democracy as well?
They absolutely could, and I do think that his I think if that sort of argument happened, I think for part of the debate, I would tell Vosh, "Okay, I'm gonna argue against you like you argue against me. Like I'm gonna pretend to be basically you, right?"
Mm-hmm.
And for that debate, it's like, okay, well, I want to develop trade blocks with the global south. Okay, well, what if the IMF just fucks over those countries, right? What if the US military just invades those countries and takes the resources and topples the governments like they've done before, right? And how would you respond to those issues? Because if your system is as theoretically vulnerable to those external pressures as mine, well, at least I have facts that have all idea that this is already something that's being addressed in the current capitalist framework. Well, at least I've got that information because I'm not sure that the theoretical sort of what if the US military, what if the IMF, what if the CIA kind of arguments, I'm not sure how that system would be more susceptible. But maybe he would say, well, if everyone was market socialist, this wouldn't be a problem. And under a market socialist system, the US military and the IMF either maybe wouldn't exist or they would be scaled down significantly so they wouldn't have as much influence. But to your point, also, obviously, it's correct that trade agreements can happen currently that have labor standards and things like that. That was one of the sticking points of the TPP from a more progressive angle was sort of this international, wage standard. I think that was even something that I want to say that was even something in the US, I think it was called the USMCA, basically the Trump NAFTA agreement was trying to equalize labor standards to a certain extent between the US and Mexico. Don't quote me on that, but I remember reading something about like that was a big sticking point was the idea that Mexican labor was underpriced and that was uncompetitive for US domestic manufacturers. And that was something that the USMCA tried to address. So, um, I think it's certainly true that those sorts of agreements can happen under a capitalist framework as well.
Hmm. Yeah, and I guess that this is and this comes back to an argument that you made before, right? So, um, I think probably the way that this would be argued from Vosh's side with stuff like this would be that hey, a society that is market socialist would be more likely to solve for these issues than one that is capitalist, and
Sure.
I mean, to that extent, that is probably correct. And I even see somebody in chat point this out here. So my biggest problem with the argument couldn't just be done in a social democracy is that you can technically hammer in a nail with your fist. However, using a hammer is probably more sensible now. And the issue I see with this is that sure, if we hypothesize and we conceptualize of a market socialist economy or market socialist world, that world would probably be more likely to have solved this than the currently existing one. However, if we put things on a continuum, right, and we're like, okay, so this is the continuum of where we are right now, and this like more left wing sort of like economic system that exists under entirely market socialist. Now, I think, and this makes more sense to me, that things like reforming the IMF, economic development, yada, 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 comes earlier on that continuum than does entirely market socialism, like have that as the dominant economic system. So sure, a market socialist society has a greater like likelihood of having this solved, but it would have been solved like on the way there more than okay, it's there and now it can be solved. And you kind of touched on this in one of your arguments in the opening that was kind of like moved away from, and you went to the general discussion, which where you're like, hey, social and cultural paradigm changes can result for this, and it's more likely than this like sort of global socialist like revolution or change in paradigm. And that's sort of how I would counter that, right? Is that hey, sure, market socialism more likely to have solved this, but it's more likely for us to get from where we are right now to like better economic development, better IMF than from where we are now to market socialism. So that's kind of like how I would work with that argument. And you kind of made a similar argument to that in the debate. And I think Vaush recognized that was kind of strong because from that we kind of circled back to an equal exchange, and then that was never touched on again, which was yeah one of the things that I noticed during the debate. Um,
I guess so. I think that if the argument originally started and then restated now is social democracy is more likely to solve for this problem than market socialism, or in general, like you said, it is more likely that it will be solved with social democracy before market socialism ever even gets to solve this problem.
mhm,
Uh, that's fair, but it seemed that Bosch was not necessarily attacking that position. It seemed that more so he was attacking like the most fundamental position, which was that, in fact, social democracy will never solve this problem, right?
mhm,
And he even agreed, you could say conceded, whatever, in the debate that in fact it's theoretically possible. We could look at the trade inflows and outflows. We could imagine a world where developed nations pour money into developing nations and get them on trade parity, but that just won't happen. And in fact, there's no signs of that happening, according to Vaush, right? And I think that that's why I think I tried to focus more on. Well, no, actually, there's quite a few signs of this
mhm,
happening, and it was it was difficult because it seemed like when we got into that part of the discussion, Vosh either narrowed his statements to the point that they became sort of structurally difficult to engage with, or he just flatly did not accept those examples as actual examples. Like, for instance, when we were talking about the idea of companies taking environmental pledges, it's like, okay, well, give me even one example of a company doing like anything good for the environment, right? And, or something like that, right? And it's like,
mhm,
okay, well, let's look at Chase Bank implementing environmental lending standards across their entire sort of E&P exploration and production portfolio, I should say, right? Um, oh, well, that's just a pledge. It's like, okay, well, let's look at the whole entire sort of post 2015 history of ESG investing that's happening right now. Oh, well, that doesn't significantly harm those companies' cash flow. And it's like, okay, so according to Vosh, the only satisfactory example would
mhm.
be a company that is currently incredibly carbon intensive, that cuts the shit out of its carbon emissions,
Yeah,
that
the
kills
industry
its
kills
free
itself.
cash
Yeah,
flow.
exactly.
Yeah, like he basically wants like he wants an example of like he wants like ExxonMobil to be like, yeah, as of today, we're gonna stop drilling oil. Fuck our company, fuck our free cash flow. We just love the environment and we want to do that. And obviously, when we've narrowed it down to such sort of an incredibly specific example,
Mhm.
it's difficult to engage with. To be fair, people sent me examples of that after the debate, but like off the fly, it just like that's such an absurd talking point. Like he even made the claim that he seemed to say or insinuate in the debate that um, companies literally only do charity for tax deductions, and it's like, oh my Jesus Christ! Like I wasn't expecting to have like an actual finance discussion, but that's just absurd. That's not true. You could say it's PR focused, like oh they just do it for PR. Um, but the reality is I don't that doesn't really agree or disagree with either of our point. My point is that just that companies are doing it, whether it's to look good or because they love the charities they're giving to.
Mhm.
That's sort of immaterial to the conversation because if socially we're pressuring companies to look good and to do charity, whether they're doing it on their own volition or they're doing it because of social pressure, is sort of irrelevant to the conversation. In fact, that's probably more of a point to my sort of argument that social pressure does exist and it is causing these companies to transition. Um, and so that was, I think, the part of the conversation where I think Vosh did the poorest, because it did seem it seemed like such an absolutist position. It was hard to sort of, I think, for him to dig himself out of it. And I think that's kind of what ended up resulting in the end of the debate, which was Voss just kind of saying, "You know what? I just don't believe you." And he just had to research more, and
Yeah.
obviously respect him for that, for maybe doing some, researching it himself is obviously the best thing he could do if that's the point in the debate that if that's how he felt after the debate, basically.
Yeah, I guess. I think that you touched on something else here to bring us to like a new part of this. And I also want to mention here again, um, in chat, just for like people that are still a bit yeah, a bit unsure about what I'm saying. So I'm perfectly happy with social democracy coming first. The argument of, well, if capitalist countries beat up the newer socialist countries, we shouldn't just stick with those since they already understand them, is weak. That would be like saying that we should stick with trains since air travel hasn't been invented yet. Can we put some effort towards the experimental system? We wouldn't have airplanes if everybody said, hey, we already have trains. Why bank on this new thing in regards to planes? So, what I just described, the continuum thing, that's not an argument against getting to the end of the continuum. That is an argument against the fact that only the end of the continuum can solve for problems that will probably be solved on the progression towards that end of the continuum. So that's kind of like what I'm saying there. So I just I want to clarify that for a bit. But then something you talked about here, and I think that this part of the debate also was a part where I think you were making a like a weaker version of the arguments that you could have been making when it comes to the things generally of like companies doing things out of their own free volition and free will. How it sounded like the whole government policy thing and government regulation was kind of conceded to Vaush's side of the argument when in reality, hey, government policy and government regulation, they are part and parcel of a social democracy, right? That should absolutely not be something that is like conceded to the opposition. So it sounded like a lot of the arguments that you were making there when it comes to companies voluntarily doing X, Y, and Z, they sounded, and I understand why they sounded this way. They sounded kind of ANCAP-esque in nature because the key focus there was like, okay, how the markets kind of solves for this themselves and how they themselves show tendencies towards moving towards these like better, more socially virtuous goals and whatever. When what should have been the thing is that, hey, everything that you're talking about, the government policy, I mean, that's part of social democracy, right? That's part of capitalism. That should be included in my model. You don't have to just argue for, okay, the markets, like firms, are gonna sort of like organically, I guess, do these things because of changing cultural interests. The entire regulation part should also be part of your arguments. And it kind of felt like you maybe like subconsciously conceded that part of the or that entire side of the social democratic model to his side, which yeah.
No, I understand that feeling. I do think that I I I understand like how you could see that, but I think it's I think broadly though, I did say several times that I'm not a libertarian, I'm not an NCAP. I believe government regulation is absolutely part of the mix here. When you say why would they do it, I interpret that as the company side. So give examples of companies doing sort of more altruistic or good things generally, or things that we would as progressives or left of center people feel would be good. And so I gave those examples the best I could. And we also had a fairly decent enough debate about Vosh made the claim that basically environmental regulations, even the regulations, they always get stripped away because of capitalist lobbying. But again, that I feel like I, as adequately as I could have, responded to that, which is to say that, well, look, environmental regulations aren't always the strongest when they originally sort of are conceived or come into being. And nobody working in business, even in carbon intensive businesses, would agree with that. And so I think we had a decent enough discussion about the role of regulation. It seemed that based on that, if we had had a more extensive discussion about the role of regulation and sort of the propensity for governments with capitalists economies to reform the environments and reform supply chains, it seemed like Vaush, as he did, would have relied heavily on the idea that, well, big businesses just control the government, and the government is going to ultimately always acquiesce to a certain extent to big business interests. And That's kind of the conversation we ended up having, but it wasn't. It was for 5 or 10 minutes. It wasn't incredibly lengthy though.
Exactly. It would have been super interesting to see that be like a broader part of the discussion. Absolutely. Um, Now, before we get to the unequal exchange bit, which I also wanted to discuss, I want to talk
Yep.
about what I think, at least what I perceived, was Vosh's absolute strongest argument in the debate. And I
All
don't
right.
feel like it was properly addressed on your side during the debate. So,
Let's do it.
this argument came up when you were discussing in the very beginning about the extent of an equal exchange and what effect it really has on the economy. And one of the things you brought up, and I'd heard this study we brought up before in this analysis, was like a an economic or sorry, statistical model for trying to map and predict the United States economy, assuming they just stop trade across the board. And it was pinned at, I think that was around 3% or something like that. Or no, sorry, that was 2 to 8% of American GDP would be lost. 3% was the unequal exchange bit. And yeah, and that was like, okay, the U.S. economy, the GDP would shrink by 2 to 8%, but as a whole, like it's like a recession. It's not like completely ground shattering for an economy. Now, Vosh's rebuttal to this, which I thought was really good, was that okay, hey, let's actually think about this. Let's think about this 2 to 8% in American GDP. It's not just taken off the top, right? It could come from very, very important industries. So what if a disproportionate amount of this 2 to 8% American GDP, or a really important part of the economy as a whole, is heavily, heavily hit by the elimination of trade? And then the fact that this one sector, this one industry, I think Vosh talked a little bit afterwards about like, like lithium and stuff, or like rare earth minerals or whatever, for basically the entirety of the tech sector. How, hey, even though like on the first hand, in the first wave, it will just shrink the economy by X percentages, the fact that different sectors of the economy interact with one another is obviously going to cause that, hey, if one part of the sector suffers, then others will also suffer. And because of that, there might be more like sort of like downstream effects on the economy as a whole that could be a lot more crippling than just that, percentage reduction in the GDP. And one of the examples I brought up specifically on the like for this example was Trump's tariffs, and how it kind of illustrates a similar concept. How in 2018, I think it was, Trump put tariffs on steel and aluminum, and he cut the GDP, and he made that that sector weaker basically. And the purpose of this was, hey, prevent it from being bought, externally, from being imported. Let's work on steel and aluminum production here in the United States of America. And what happened? Sure, steel and aluminum employment in America went up, but all the other industries that relied on steel and aluminum to function suffered dramatically because the steel and aluminum, industry suffered so much, to the point where of all the sort of industries that were adversely affected by the increased price and inefficiency of the steel and aluminum sector, the amount of jobs and economic productivity lost there far, far, far outweighed by scales of magnitude the benefits to the steel and aluminum industries themselves in the US. So, what would be your rebuttal to this sort of like potential limitation to the fact that, hey, it's not just off the top? Where this 2 to 8% lands is extraordinarily important when it comes to what effect it really have on the economy as a whole.
Yeah, sure. So I think that the Trump tariffs aren't a totally unreasonable example to illustrate that point. I do think that um, uh, they're a very it's sort of a drop in the bucket sort of example, because obviously ending all trade is a lot different than just implementing some tariffs. But I do see your broader point.
Mhm.
I feel like I responded as about as adequately as I could, because I do go into the paper's actual methodology, and I talk about how the authors take into account the substitutability of trade. They even call out the reason they focus on the U.S. The U.S. might arguably be a special example of autarky being a for those that don't know, our autarky is just the idea that your economy is sort of self-reliant and you
Mhm.
don't necessarily need external trade, but or external investment. And um, the idea would be that, well, because the U.S. is so big and has so much resource wealth and sort of ability to make most things domestically if they had to, that the substitutability of trade with the U.S. is a bit lower than a country like Belgium, where they call out in the paper where if Belgium just cut off all trade, Belgium would be much more significantly impacted in terms of economic growth and absolute economy in period zero than the United States. Now, I do agree that if the U.S. cut off all trade, you would certainly see a hell of a transition cost. You'd see shortages. You'd see a lot of people and suppliers scrambling. It wouldn't be good if the U.S. did that, and it would affect the broader economy. There'd absolutely be a recession, um, and things like that. The point of that paper, though, wasn't to advocate, of course, for cutting off trade. It'd be terrible
Mhm.
for the economy if we did that. The point of that paper was to illustrate the idea that um, if the U.S. just stopped trading altogether, that would ultimately be recoverable, right? And that it's not as if capitalism as we know it would collapse. It's not like the U.S. would devolve into anarchy, or anything like that. I take a lot of issue with Vaush's framing that that's a ridiculous analysis, and economists would never say that. These were two Ivy League educated economists that did this paper, right?
Mhm.
And so as I said, forget about my sort of credential. I could be lying about my credentials for all anyone knows, but this is a published paper, and so I don't think that's as reasonable a response. It's to frame an extreme example to say that this is the most extreme thing. I'm not advocating for anywhere even close to this extreme thing.
Mhm.
I'm advocating for this 1% as extreme thing, which is basically just ensuring worker parity across borders. Something that Money and Macro, he actually commented on the video, that he pointed out, and I thought it was a great point that I should have brought up if I had thought about it, which was that you could actually make a capitalist argument for businesses wanting this because, as you mentioned, gains from trade, much like losses from lack thereof of trade, are not equally distributed. And the same is true with unequal exchange. So, at the same time that some industries, if we had worker parity, would lose out in terms of basically not getting to take advantage of that cheaper labor abroad, firms domestically would be able to benefit to a certain extent because if we had worker parity, that would increase sort of that equitable competition across borders, and it would probably lead to higher wages in other sectors, right? If we had true like absolute worker parity, which isn't necessarily possible, there's always going to be some sort of geographic inequality that happens. But if we had something like that, there would be domestic workers who probably ended up with higher wages and spent that money into the economy, which means that the losses from a parity world would be diminished to a certain extent, similar to how you described with the steel tariffs, right? How it's true that the broader economy lost out with the steel tariffs because it's quite an extreme scenario that sort of Trump enacted upon us, but there were domestic actors that were advantaged by that. But I don't think that unequal exchange would have a similarly catastrophic effect. And I do think there is an argument that those effects would be diminished, especially given the you know sort of lack of extremity, I suppose, in doing that relative to cutting off all trade together.
Right, I see. So I disagree or maybe don't understand with most of the things that were said there. And I'm gonna get through them all. So here's
God
where we get into
damn.
it. All right. So the steel and aluminum, yeah, obviously it's 100% a drop in the bucket analogy. The purpose of it was just to kind of like illustrate the mechanism of how, hey, there's a lot of moving parts. They interact with one another. It doesn't just directly affect one or the other. And I actually saw that Money in Macro comment after I watched the debate. And I also thought that comment was pretty weird, so I'm happy it was brought up here so that we can talk about it even more. Second thing that you mentioned towards the end, just a small comment, unequal exchange. Yeah, I think this could be solved without major hits to the economy as well. I think that's probably true. Without like a economy-ending recession or whatever. Now, when it comes to what you mentioned here and what you thought to be like a reasonable or adequate response to this, which was the substitutability. What the fuck did I just say? Holy shit. Okay,
You're good.
substitutability. Holy shit. Okay, Swedish, European, with a weird accent, and it's a complex word, and I'm sick as fuck. It's a struggle. Okay, it's a struggle.
Substitutability. I
There we go.
believe in you.
Substitutability of trade. I still feel like that doesn't like adjust for the thing that is being talked about here. So obviously the adjusting for the substitute for fuck's sake substitutability of trade is what determines that initial what was it, 3 to 8% shrink in the economy as a whole. Now, and maybe they did this in the paper and I just don't know about it. But did they account for, okay, so step one of this, imagine all trade. Okay, now how bad, imagine getting rid of all trade. Now, okay, let's try to make a model for how badly this loss of all trade would affect sectors. So to do that, you look, okay, so what does the United States import? What industries do they go into? Yada, yada, yada. What is the substitutability of trade for all those different like imports or whatever? How does that work with the US economy? And depending on the degree of substitutability of trade, that's going to shrink the different affected import industries to different extents. Sure, I 100% understand that they did that. But my question is, once they had established that, did they then do like, okay, so now that we know how much all these import industries have shrunk, and the reason we were able to calculate that was by checking the substitutability of trade for all these different industries, now how would the economy, the rest of the economy that wasn't directly firsthand impacted by this reduction in import, react to the shrinking of those other industries? And that's what I'm not sure if they actually adjusted for in that given experiment. And then to just say one more thing on that money and macro thing,
sure.
it's a very similar thing as well. It's basically the same thing again. And this kind of didn't make sense much there either from his comment there. So he kind of made the argument that, yeah, domestic firms would benefit from reduction in, trade because more domestic industries would pick stuff up. I mean, sure, some domestic industries would pick stuff up, but as the steel and aluminum sort of, tariff and that entire thing explains, we can see that, okay, sure, even though some industries that are directly in there to substitute and take up the excess demand from the reduction in trade, the rest of the economy, which relies or had relied previously on the cheaper prices of those goods that were previously imported, all those other industries are going to suffer because those goods are now more expensive. And the reason we know they're going to get more expensive is because, hey, if it was less expensive to produce stuff in the US in the first place, then you wouldn't have need to import it in the first place. Then it would just have been produced here from in the beginning. And that also didn't kind of make sense because, yeah, sure, it benefits some industries that can directly take up that excess demand, but all the other industries that rely on those goods, they're going to suffer because the price of those products now go up. The cost of production now goes up.
Yeah, so I guess to address your first point, they do take they do take this into account a certain extent. They don't just do simple trade accounting like, oh, this is the percentage of imports, and so this is like the percentage of economy that would suffer in the long run. They take a broader view. That's why I talk about, if they did that, they would never consider the substitutability of trade in the first place. Because if they're just looking at like imports as a percent of GDP and, okay, well, roughly based on a range, that's what we would lose in terms of our gross domestic product, that wouldn't really obviously make sense because
Mhm.
they're not making the claim that the economy is a small fraction of trade. They're making the claim of if the economy, if we stopped trading, if we practice autarky, what would that look like as a broader sort of gross domestic product impact? People quibble about GDP, but it's sort of the metric we have right now that we use. And at the same time, you're right. Again, I can only say so many times that the gains from trade and the losses from lack of trade are not equally distributed. So, that's just something important to keep in mind. And the last thing that I would say in regard to your point about unequal exchange and money macros comment, I think his point wasn't necessarily that the economy would be like net better in the global north because of the gains that domestic workers might have by not having to compete with lower priced labor abroad. Rather, his point was that it is a bit more complicated than just looking at that 3%, which to be fair, I tried to explain in the debate. And we had to look at sort of the broader impact. It's similar to like how people who are against immigration might say, "Oh, well, more workers, more of a thing, less wages, lower wages, overall." But the problem with that is you're not taking into account the demand side where immigrants come in, they demand things, they spend money into the economy, businesses get more business, and that circulates money probably into more hiring, probably into higher wages. So it sort of diminishes the effect of, you know, on the supply side to a certain extent because it shifts the demand curve as well. So that was, I think, uh, sort of as best as I can explain money and macros comments. And again, to be fair, there's no reason necessarily to care about qualifications. I mean, he's a international sort of money and banking economist, probably knows a fair amount about trade. And I am not an international or trade economist. I can only engage with the literature that's presented to me or the literature that I find.
Mhm.
Um, and it seems that that is sort of broadly the case. So that's all I could really say about that.
Yeah, maybe I think the issue here is that I may not be making my point like as clear as I could be making it. So, do you think you could open up my stream on on your computer in for just like a second?
Yeah, sure, go for
Okay,
it.
cool. So let's assume that this is the US, okay? And let's just assume that they only import steel, bread, and wood. Those are the only three things that they import, and 100% of all these products that exist in the US are imported from other countries. The US produces nothing themselves. Now, this is obviously unrealistic for about 99 different reasons, but I don't think it's going to make the example like like non-functional. So what my question is that for their analysis for this reduction in 3 to 8% GDP, here is how I understand the substitutability of trade. Here's how that comes into it. So obviously for this analysis, you can't just be like, okay, no trade. This means that we lose all this 4% GDP from our steel, bread, and wood industries. They're just gone now immediately. Ta 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 ta. So we lose 12% GDP. Obviously, this is not the right way to do it. You'd have to be like, okay, so assuming we got rid of all these imports, how well could domestic industries fill the demand for these things? And then they would be like, okay, so domestically, let's put this in green, we could produce half of the steel, we could do like a quarter of the bread, and we could do three-quarters of the wood domestically. So then obviously it would be silly to just get rid of the 4% and not do the substitutability calculations, because assuming that situation would happen, then the domestic, industry would still like cover some part of this demand. Obviously not as efficient as the imports, because if it was this efficient to do it domestically, then you wouldn't import in the first place. So then the results would be like, okay, so we don't actually use 12 GDP, we lose what, 6% GDP in the end of it. I understand they did this 100%. I get this. But my question is now, okay, now that they've done these calculations, do they then take into account how a 50% cut in the GDP of the steel industry would affect things like constructions or manufacturing, how a 75% decrease in the bread industry would affect things like baking and pastries and I don't know, like just catering services? Did they then take into account how much the 1/4 drop in the wood industry would affect also like construction? Yeah, like you get the point, like any number of things here. And then did they check these as well and put those into the calculations? Or did they kind of like end it here, where they did these calculations and they got this number and didn't take into account like all of this stuff down here? That's my key question. Because it doesn't seem, I don't have reason to believe yet from what I've heard that they did this second part. Now they may have done that. I haven't read the study in itself, but yeah. Do you understand what I'm saying here?
No, I do. They do take this into account.
Okay.
I had to pull it up to get the exact quote. So they said that they acknowledge that while foreign trade assets raises the level of economic output, GDP, of course, not everyone is a winner. Consumers enjoy lower prices, but some workers may see the benefit offset by declining wages or layoffs. Now, obviously, I'm not sure. To be fair, I don't think that this is the case. I don't think that these guys are advocating for this. This is just sort of a fun theoretical thing that uh, they might bring up, and so they do take into account sort of at least based on their mindset that I've just read right now, the idea that consumer prices would increase and how this might affect the broader economy. That's one of the reasons they give a range, is that it's pretty difficult to determine the exact loss of GDP and production, sort of productive capacity of economy, if you shut down trade, because it's a very sort of alien thing. I mean, even like the most shut down economies in the world do some amount of trading. Um,
Hmm.
for like North Korea relies on Chinese imports to a certain extent, for an example. And so I think that they do sort of properly take this into account in their analysis. Again, they do talk about how other countries would be more or less affected by this. They referenced Belgium as an example. Um, so again, though, I think that this conversation is suffering from part of the conversation that with Vosh, which was that this is not my point, right? This is just an extreme example to illustrate that the reality is that getting rid of unequal exchange, which is a subsection of the economy, which is trade, all the way down to unequal exchange, is a lot more doable and less extreme. And ultimately, to be fair, wouldn't actually limit any global north country from importing any good that they wanted. And when I say country, really we're talking about actors within those countries, like companies and people who might import things. They could still buy anything from abroad that they wanted in a scenario with, sort of global worker parity, right?
Hmm.
Again, this is just an extreme example to illustrate an extreme point that we could survive without this, although it would be painful. And similar to unequal exchange, there'd be some discomfort, and there'd be pain regarding getting rid of unequal exchange, but it would in fact be possible. And we do see moves to alleviate that issue in the country, or in
Okay,
the
yeah.
broader global north, I should say.
So, to restate, I 100% understand that nobody's arguing for the removal of all trade or anything like that.
Yeah, for sure.
This whole thing is mostly just for like personal curiosity, I guess. So the quote you read out, it obviously, I don't necessarily think it fully proves that they did this. What it seems to prove is they obviously like talked about consumer prices and the loss of things there. But did they talk about like the loss of prices? Obviously, I think they did it for these three industries. So like the increase in consumer prices of steel, bread, and wood, 100% they did that. But did they also take into consideration the change of prices and stuff from all the other industries affected by the change in price and supply of steel, bread, and wood? That's what I'm still not sure whether or not they did, and I don't think that that quote necessarily like supports the fact that they did this second layer of analysis as well. Now they may have done it, and I think the best thing to probably do here is not to like sit here and like interrogate you on whether or not they did this. It would probably be for me to read it myself. But I was just curious if you like offhandedly knew whether or not they had done like both of these two levels of analysis here. But yeah, okay. So the next thing we've kind of been arguing around this for or not arguing, but we've been talking around this for quite a while. That is the whole unequal exchange thing, and I think it's definitely an interesting part of the debate. For just introduction to this topic, I looked up like a definition of this during the debate, and it seems to have given me a like satisfactory amount of understanding to understand like the rest of this, how the debate went and what was being talked about. I recognize that there was one part in which Vaush like kind of completely misunderstood what an equal exchange meant. He kind of seemed to believe that the entirety of the exchange is unequal. So when he was doing his calculations for like how he thought that getting rid of unequal exchange would affect an economy, instead of like guessing, okay, so how much of a percentage of all our imports accounts for an equal exchange, it kind of was like, okay, well, there is an equal exchange in the imports, so therefore all of our imports are an equal exchange. So we should throw that all out for our analysis. That was kind of misunderstood there. And I kind of recognize that. So yeah, do you think we want to just talk about this for a bit? Maybe you can give probably a lot more of a comprehensive, explanation for what an equal exchange is than I was able to find and give during the debate, and then we can go from there.
Yeah, sure. You want to, I guess, ask me a question, start me off.
Yeah, sure. What is an equal exchange?
Yeah, so unequal exchange is more or less just that if we compared sort of the productive labor across countries. So I use the example of like Indian sort of wood processors. So if an Indian worker could produce, process 1 pound of wood an hour, and an American worker could produce 1 pound of wood an hour, unequal exchange might say that the Indian workers paid less, even though they're equally productive. Another part of unequal exchange we didn't get as much into in the debate with Vaush might be the idea that if I produce a hamburger in the United States, like just basically a beef patty with cheese and two buns, and I were to produce that exact same down to the atom hamburger in say trying to think of like a Indonesia, for example, right?
Oh, well, that's
Um,
so. I was actually thinking of Indonesia exactly in my head when you said, okay. Wow.
I didn't want to say India because they don't really eat much beef there. So I was
Yeah.
like, oh, what country in the same region?
You tapped into my mind waves with
I
that
could
one.
have said
Holy shit.
Pakistan.
Okay, okay, I see.
But if we were to produce the exact same hamburger across nations, and we were to then do an exchange rate, just what are the comparative currencies worth? Um, you would find that the burger in Pakistan is cheaper, right? And so some have argued that this is also an example of unequal exchange, where the relative price of goods that the global South sells to the global North are cheaper than they would be otherwise if the global North nations bought from each other or produced them domestically. And there's probably more reasonable arguments that might not even be necessarily unequal exchange, but I'd have to do more dive into the literature to determine that. But and to be fair, also people seem to mostly focus on the wage aspect, where basically, cheap labor abroad makes goods, drives the cost of goods down, and so we import those goods because cheap labor.
Okay, makes sense. I guess the next question would be, and you said you were in favor of getting rid of unequal exchange. So, why is unequal exchange a bad thing, and what would be the effects of solving it?
Well, unequal exchange isn't necessarily a good thing, just because it's good for some people. Obviously, like you and Vosh and I would all say that it's certainly it's inarguably good materially for people in the global north because we get cheaper stuff, right?
Mm,
And our incomes go up. But it's bad for those people in global south nations because they're not paid necessarily what they should be paid based on their productivity. If we assume that an Indian worker is worth the proportional amount of their productivity as an American worker, there's no reason they shouldn't be paid that proportional amount. And there's no reason necessarily that they wouldn't be able to command that proportional price. To be fair, though, on the pricing side, it seems like that's more based on sort of the size of the country. But again, that's a whole other discussion. That's why it's bad, really, in terms of the effects of ending unequal exchange. There's sort of two schools of thought. So,
oh,
what if we?
sorry for interrupting. Maybe before we
Sure,
should
go
do
on.
that, we should talk about how would you even go about ending unequal exchange, and then we talk about the effects.
Sure. So I think that from my perspective, the way that under like a capitalist system would end unequal exchange would um, really what it would have to do with is part on the investor side, so and sort of the consumer side. So consumers and investors would continuously probably become more and more socially conscious, and we're starting to see that materialize in sort of these pledges where companies are trying either uh, you know you could say in the spirit of those requests, but also maybe trying to get under them, but they're trying at least to appear or act in more sort of sustainable ways. And so part of that would be continuing that and expanding that and doing more advocacy and calling out companies that engage in poor labor practices or toxic sort of negotiating practices with other countries and their production. So that's part of it. Part of it's government regulation. So, when I say regulation, I mean that countries could begin completely banning goods that contain slave labor and practices like that, which we've already seen to a certain extent. Banning imports that were made with child labor could be a certain thing that countries could do. And in terms of equalizing, wages across nations, what we have is just a little bit more internationalization of trade, trade agreements that had labor standards and independent courts that would verify those standards. So, if we signed free trade agreements, we could have standards in there which says that workers have to have these minimum labor standards. They have to have this minimum wage. They've got to be represented by this, international or domestic union or something like that. And that if there's any disputes on those labor practices, there would be some sort of third party arbitration where labor would be represented in that dispute. And those are some of the ways that countries and companies and people would go about trying to solve unequal exchange.
Okay. So maybe this stems from me still not exactly grasping this concept, But wouldn't the abolition or the elimination, sorry, of an equal exchange also entail the elimination of things like comparative advantage?
No, no, not at all necessarily. I mean, because to be fair, comparative advantage is sort of a it's kind of a theoretical construct. Typically, the way you learn about comparative advantage in economics, or like the examples you might give, are, um, hey, country X and Y make paper and electronics, right? And they both make paper and electronics. And country A is bigger than, or country X is bigger than country Y, right? So country X has an absolute advantage in terms of making paper and electronics because they're bigger. They can make more of those things than country Y. But country Y might realize that they have a comparative advantage in producing electronics. So instead of producing paper, they might just say, "Well, fuck producing paper. We're a lot better at actually, producing electronics." And country X might assume, "Hey, we're actually better at producing paper." So instead of producing both goods, they start producing their, comparative advantage product either way, and we end up with those gains of trade because country X can more efficiently produce electronics and country Y can more proficiently produce paper. And so they would trade those things, more output, more efficiency. The gains of trade are essentially the different outputs you get over time. But the reality is, though, is that most countries do produce most things, even if they don't have necessarily comparative advantage in doing them. Like the U.S. has always had a domestic steel industry, despite the fact that we can get cheaper steel from elsewhere. We've always had a car industry, despite the fact that American cars have, um, at least in my experience, not quite been as quality as Japanese vehicles, as an
Mhm.
example. And so stuff like that exists. And other countries, for instance, have private defense contractors, despite the U.S. sort of having an advantage in that regard. So, I think that comparative advantage wouldn't necessarily go away without unequal exchange. It just might mean that the sort of the relative sort of industry differences across countries might change as a mix a little bit, but without unequal exchange, India would still have wood producers, and so would the United States. It's just that India might be able to more effectively capture that market than the United States because they might be better at producing wood, efficiently than the United States is.
So maybe okay, maybe I phrased the original question a bit strangely. So, assuming that you get rid of unequal exchange, so people all around the world are paid a set amount for a set amount of productivity. So you equalize the discrepancies between productivity and compensation all across the world. Um, wouldn't it just then be the case that most countries would just tend to flow towards autarky? Because at that point, when if like compensation for
Yeah.
productivity is kind of the same in all these situations, then why would you have to pay that? But then also on top of
Yeah.
that, have to pay like shipping prices and stuff like that, as well to get them into
No.
your economy. Why wouldn't you just try to do everything domestically?
Yeah, so to be clear, you necessarily would be equalizing wages, but you wouldn't be equalizing productivity. So some people argue. I think this was a poor point in the Vaush debate. So like the guy that I cited, Jason Hickel, not Jackson Hinkle, Jason Hickel, he said that there's good evidence that workers in the global south are just as productive as workers in the global north. And he cites a Mexican manufacturing plant being more productive. And that was like, I think, quite literally his only example in that paper of that.
Mhm.
But so some people think that workers in the global south are just as productive. But I think at least the evidence I've engaged with, doesn't seem to prove that in an aggregate scale.
Yeah, and it
But
makes sense,
uh,
right? Because of different levels of infrastructural and educational development and the rest of
Yeah,
it. Yeah.
different infrastructure, different government stabilities. I mean, like, Sudan's probably not going to be quite as productive right now as like, like Botswana or something,
Mhm.
because Sudan's currently going through a civil war.
Mhm.
And so there's all sorts of internal dynamics. So comparative advantage would still exist because it probably wouldn't be the case that every country would be equally productive at producing everything in sort of an unequal exchange free world. You'd still have like Chinese workers might be better at manufacturing and processing like raw materials. You might see Taiwanese workers still be more productive and better at manufacturing electronics compared to American workers. And so you'd still have productivity differences probably because comparative advantage is a thing that exists. Um, but just for that, per unit of productivity, workers would be paid the same, and per quality of good, they would be able to command the same price.
Okay, so just to explain it back to you to ensure that I understand this. So it's not so much that, hey, once this is all equalized, like if you get X amount of price for X amount of productivity for a given good, then you might as well produce everything themselves, because the key thing that still isn't resolved is a difference in productivity between all these different sorts of like industries and stuff like that. And because so many countries will be able to specialize and be hyper productive in certain things compared to other countries, it will still be like, better, and it will be possible actually to obtain those quantities of goods that you need from those other countries because their productivity is better. So it becomes sort of like less of a question of like price and demand, and more a question of obtaining stuff on the basis of quantity. Does that kind of track?
Sort of, yeah. I mean, it's similar to how, like, for instance, if we were to be able to alleviate all these institutional inequalities, right? Say every country had like a totally stable government and like great education opportunities, social democracy sort of haven where everyone has great welfare and sort of educational opportunities, healthcare, stuff like that. Um, there would still be sort of natural inequalities and cultural inequalities that face. Some people might be more geared towards certain work, and some countries might just have natural resources that other countries don't, and so they would necessarily have a comparative advantage in those sorts of things, or comparative disadvantages, those sorts of things that they're predisposed to not have. So, for instance, you're probably not going to import a lot of water from like Libya, right? If
Mm.
you need like fresh water in your country, right? And you're probably going to mostly get your iron from Australia because they just have the most iron, right? And so stuff like that would still exist even in a world that was sort of, uh, you know, based on wage and prices equal across borders.
Okay, so then another way to explain this would be then like, hey, you still retain a lot of comparative advantage, but you strip some reasons behind comparative advantage away. So you strip aspects of comparative advantage that stem from worse labor regulations and conditions in some countries, for instance. That's stripped away. So overall comparative advantage, I'm not going to say weakened, but is less sort of like drastic once you get rid of unequal exchange, but there will
Sure.
still be factors that contribute to comparative advantage, and those factors will be ones that you wouldn't have like ethical like problems with, I guess, such as like more
Yeah,
iron in
sure.
Australia.
So yeah, like if part of your comparative advantage in trade, like comparatively, we can produce this, and to me, I think comparative advantage mostly has to do with like productive capacity. But if we expanded it a little bit and said that, you know, if part of the reason why countries trade with me is because I have incredibly cheap labor, and we were
Hmm.
to equalize that, well, those trade balances would definitely change, right?
Hmm.
And so, yeah, to a certain extent, um, you would be amending trade balances, and they would reflect sort of a new uh, dynamic of trade under this system, certainly.
Hmm. Okay, yeah, sure, that makes perfect sense. Um, all right, and right now you said that the proportion of the GDP that the global north like generates or gets advantage of because of things like an equal exchange tends amounts to around 3% of GDP.
Yeah, if you were to take the the unequal exchange that Jason Hickel calculated essentially, and you were to put that over GDP, you end up with 3%.
Okay. Um, yep, that makes sense. So I think, oh my fucking god, my voice crack, holy shit. Okay. I
It's
think that
okay.
that was
Puberty's tough.
sorry.
I
What did
said
you say?
puberty can be tough, man.
Okay, yeah, yeah, yeah. Um, yeah, I think that was probably the key things I had up for us to talk about. Do you have anything else particularly on your mind except for making fun of me for going through puberty?
Look, okay, I'm not making fun of you. Okay, I understand your struggle. But no, would you call yourself a capitalist?
Um, how I personally, my view on economy is the answer is not that simple. No, but currently, I am a social democrat, right? I argue towards social democratic reform. Now, a few months ago, like I think it was like half a year or more than half a year ago. How long ago was it? Let me actually check. Rose wrist list do not. Um, so 4 months. Oh shit, that wasn't even that long ago. 4 months ago, I made a video called "Why I Do Not Identify as a Socialist?" Because previous to that, I called myself a socialist. I was like a market socialist, and those were the policies I argued for. Now, around 4 months ago as well, I made a really big research document on cooperative firms. And in this document, I looked over all the data and I got a much more in depth understanding of cooperative firms than I ever had before. And previous to me doing that, my policy was kind of like, hey, you should mandate co ops for an entire economy. And that's how you avoid all the negative ethical things, worker exploitation, no democracy, yada, 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 X, Y, and Z. However, upon looking upon the state of research that exists for worker cooperatives, we have nowhere near the amount of ground that is necessary to stand on to be able to demonstrate that an economy which mandates cooperatives wouldn't have a fuck ton of potentially unforeseen negatives or issues that could dramatically like hamper an economy to a really really strong and really really significant extent. In addition to that, there are also existing issues that we know about for co-ops that would probably just be amplified if they were all of the economy, for instance. So that was the main reason there. So I still think that like ceteris paribus, assuming that we could have two economies with the exact same level of productivity and GDP, and basically they were entirely like output wise the exact same, but one of them was co-ops and one of them was conventional firms, I would probably prefer the conventional firms one, but we have no way of knowing whether or not that is possible to do. So in the moment, I am only going to
Mhm.
argue for things that I know and I have the empirical ground to stand on to be effective. And for things that I believe could potentially work in the future, I'm going to argue for an expansion and an increase in research on that topic. So in my co-op document, for instance, you will see at the bottom a wide range of different policies designed to basically see how co-ops would function at a bigger scale, do more research on them, and then try to draw better conclusions on what exactly like a co-op
Yeah.
economy would look like.
So it did you may have misspoke. So when you said if we had two economies that were literally the exact same and one of them is cooperatively managed and one of them is conventionally managed, you said
Mhm.
you'd pick the conventional one.
Oh, did I say that? I
Um,
meant to pick the cooperative one. My bad.
you meant the cooperative one. Okay, I was a
Yeah.
little confused. Yeah, okay,
Yeah.
that makes more sense. What are some of the problems? So I did a video on worker cooperatives and part of the potential issue with mandating them, like you described,
Mhm.
and I'm doing a follow up that's like 4 times as long. And I saw your research document, and it was definitely useful for my purposes. But from your perspective, what are some of the structural issues that you would see in an economy that was completely cooperatively organized?
So issues that I see with co-ops was that I actually have an entire segment on this on the document limitations here just to make sure I don't miss anything. So um, number one, I think the most obvious issues is issues with like capital infusion. Now, obviously, this will depend on what type of co-op it is and what the state of the given like industry is and about 99 different factors. But if we equalize and adjust for those factors, it's oh my god, my voice cracks. Holy shit. There is basically no
You're good.
situation in which a co-op company would be a more like favorable investment for an external investor than a private company. Now, obviously, people do still invest in co-ops, and part of the reason for that might be because of the co-ops that they're just doing better, you know. But assuming that like actual like output or whatever of the co-ops were the same and the performance were kind of similar, in those situations you would always want to pick the private one because you're more likely to have a stronger degree of control over like how that firm would operate with your investments. And for some investors, that is very important. And that's just not quite as achievable with co-ops. There will always be limited a little bit in their ability to be able to like ingest capital than what conventional firms are. Second problem, which this is something I didn't even know about until I started reading about this. I I went up to adjust my glasses, but they broke just like half an hour ago, so I just rubbed myself in the nose really awkwardly. was the hazard rate for high skilled workers and high skilled labor. So because worker co-ops have a much more compressed wage structure, high skilled workers could earn a fuck ton more money if they went and worked for a conventional like company abroad instead of saying in like the country that is market socialist. And that's simply because while the median wage goes way up in a cooperative firm, the top level wages, the top like bracket for wage earners within that firm is going to go down then as well. And because of that, if you're working from your own personal interest and you're highly skilled, highly qualified, got a lot of credentials and whatever, and you get to pick between a cooperative firm and a conventional firm with like the same amount of like money in circulation, you're gonna pick the conventional firm because you personally can be accommodated for, or you can personally get more money from that. And then furthermore, just issues when it comes to like starting up costs for cooperatives are pretty difficult. Once again, this kind of stems back to their issues in acquiring outside equity again. And yeah, I think those are the main things that we know about. But another key thing here is the fact that right now we see cooperatives being, successful, having good outcomes, whatever, in the limited capacity they exist today. However, assuming that they were like mandated nationally, there could be a wide range of different negatives that we don't even know about right now, because when looking up this, research on cooperative firms is pretty limited. There isn't like a whole bunch of them, a whole bunch of studies on them. There's less, like there's a handful that are well known, and then it's kind of like it. There's a few here and there, but they aren't like very good or very comprehensive or whatever. Or there's just basically a bunch of issues with them. So that's another thing. We basically don't know what such a big policy change could entail or what negatives that could bring.
Yeah, that's true. I think problem is that I think a lot of evidence for cooperatives is sort of transitive. So a lot of the research that people will cite defending like worker, uh, ownership, uh, is that it's worker ownership. It's not cooperative. So like employee stock ownership companies are not worker cooperatives
Mm-hmm.
in the strictest sense, right? And a lot of cooperatives also don't have like equal equity, and they also use a lot of like you said, contract labor and stuff. And so, like for instance, I think I saw somewhere that Mondragon, only 40% of their employees are actually members of
Mm-hmm.
the cooperative, which it's actually a lot lower than I would have assumed. But obviously, feel free to fact check me on that. It's just what I read. But um, and so in an economy where everyone, if you work, you have to work for a cooperative because that's all that's available. I think there could be a lot of sort of you'd say externalities to that are pretty difficult to account for. And to be fair, also pretty much all the research on worker cooperatives specifically are just comparative in nature, right? They're just saying, hey, look at these cooperatives. This is what they're like. Look at these non-cooperative businesses. This is what they're like. Let's compare them,
Mm-hmm.
right? And we see that worker cooperatives might be more resilient. They might have less stable wages but more stable employment. Things like this. And so, but that's not really the sort of experimental design that's necessarily something you'd want. Like, and this is stuff that's happened before, but it's hard to collect the data for it. Like, what you'd want ideally would be companies that were not cooperatives, and then based on buyouts or based on whatever organization became cooperatives, which is a fairly high percentage of them that ended up, they were conventional at one point and then they became cooperatives afterwards. You'd want to look at the relative differences in their productivity and their production and their prices and their wage structure before and after. That would be like your best possible experiment. But nobody that I can see has done that sort of research. Probably, like I said, because the data is just like super duper difficult to collect, especially when you're talking about private firms. As far as I'm aware, there's no publicly traded cooperative, I guess, because that wouldn't really make. I guess it could make sense with non-voting shares, but that is not a thing that exists that I know of. But
Yeah.
no, I'm doing a. To me, the big issues with worker cooperatives, and the second part that I'm going to bring up is higher cost of hiring as a macro structure, I should say.
Mm-hmm.
Higher cost of hiring. They probably would struggle to a certain extent with capital investment. Like that's just a sort of a hurdle that would need to be solved. And I think someone also mentioned that it's a fairly risky investment for an employee. Like investing in like buying into your specific business's cooperative is like a way more risky parking of money than
Then
like a
just getting a
broad market
paycheck, right?
index or something
Yeah.
like that. Yeah, exactly. Well,
Mm.
yeah, you probably getting a paycheck if you work for a cooperative, but that
You
equity
don't have
that
to
you
pay
have
in
tied
to
up
get the
in the
paycheck. You just have
cooperative.
to put labor in. While in a co-op, you have to pay in and put labor in, and then yeah, you get a return.
Exactly, and if your business fails, you've lost. I mean, that's why any financial planner would say, don't you shouldn't like if your 401k shouldn't just be one like car company or something, right? You
Mhm.
should have
Yeah,
a
exactly. You want to
diversified
diversify. Yeah.
index. Exactly. And that's some food for thought. And then something I've never heard anyone else really talk about was that I feel like there'd be a lot of inequalities in this system, sort of naturally, where I think your credit history would be so much more relevant in a system that mandated cooperative organization. Because like right now, sure, some companies will ask you for your credit history, but that's like an exception, not necessarily the rule. And
Mhm.
I think that in a system where every applicant is also a former business owner, it's like, well, what's your credit history? What's the history of the cooperatives you worked at? Why are you leaving me? Are you leaving me because your cooperative failed? Well, you were an equal part in the reason why that cooperative failed, right? So like, why would I necessarily want to take a risk on you when I'm giving you equal equity to make decisions? And apparently that led to potentially the failure of those businesses before. And so, like, how you would regulate out of that seems very complicated, right? Like right now, if you've got a terrible credit score, that just means you might not be able to get a loan for like a car or a house, but you can still get a job, right?
Mhm.
Whereas in a cooperative economy, your credit history might be a much more it might be more like a social credit score almost, where like you might just be shut out of society altogether,
Yeah.
which is interesting, sort of food for thought.
Yeah.
But yeah, no, that's all. That is interesting, sort of cooperative conversation. I'm working on like I said, a follow up video about it. But is there anything else you wanted to talk about?
I think it was that mostly, and like you said, the entire credit thing. That's exactly the type of like potentially unforeseen consequences that like a macro implementation of this business model could have. Just generally, that is just like, okay, maybe we should wait a bit longer before you make the hard prescriptive statements when it comes to what you want to do and stuff like that. And then the other thing you mentioned, just to elaborate on that a bit, like when it comes to studies, there's also just like a massive selection bias when it comes to like, hey, all the studies right now are people that do an alternative form of business. So they're probably going to be more likely to be read into different types of business, more likely to be like hyper invested in these types of firms, more likely to have like an inherent or like a stronger drive towards being in a cooperative firm than being a conventional firm. And we don't know if this would like extrapolate the same way if everybody had to go into a cooperative firm, more than like, okay, right now we have the people that make the unconventional decision to do so. So that's like another thing generally that just like sort of like overshadows a lot of the research that we have right now working cooperatives. Um, but but yeah, I think that was no, those were the main things really I had to mention here.